I want to call the 5 p.m. work session to order for Monday, July 28th, 2025. Conduct a roll call, and I'll do that at the kitchen.
Here.
Ms. Copeland?
Present.
Ms. McLemore?
Present.
And I'm here as well. Ward 2, Mr. Grizz is here. Okay. All right. Before you use the agenda for the work session for approval, do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Being none, I'll take the vote. Mr. Kitchen, start it off.
Aye.
Aye.
And aye. Thank you very much. Ms. Boone, will you please conduct a roll call of your members? All right, thank you. This time, have a presentation from the City Manager Oglesby, review of the FY25 Franklin Public School budget. Ms. Oglesby? Oh, there you are. Sorry.
So good evening, members of City Council and members of the school board. Tonight is just going to be a presentation to share the results of review, the financial matter as it relates to the Franklin Public Schools FY25 operating budget. First, I thought it'd be a good idea just to do a very high level of responsibilities of both the school board and the City Council, especially since we have new members on the school board and City Council, and this is y'all very first joint meeting. So when it comes to the role for the City Council approves the overall city budget. It allocates funding for the schools as part of the city budget, and this is to include any budget amendments. It appropriates funding, its local share, to the schools either by a lump sum or determined by the Virginia State Code and classifications. It also retains the responsibility of appropriating funds during the fiscal year. And so when it comes to appropriating to the schools in terms of major classification, these are the classifications that the council can appropriate the funds into. It could be in instructions, administration, attendance and health, public transportation, operations and maintenance, school, food service and other non-instructional operations, facilities, debt, fund and transfer, technology, and contingency reserves. The ones that you see in green are the categories that the council appropriated the FY26 funds into. So by them appropriating it into a classification, that means that the schools cannot move money across those classifications without coming back to the City Council for approval. And so the role of the school board, it manages and controls the public education funds, is required to report its expenditures to the governing body at least once a year, and is prohibited for spending or contracting to spend any money more than the funds available for school purposes during the fiscal year without the consent of the governing body. So these are the three funds that the school board has. You have the general fund, which encompasses a majority of all of those classifications that we just talked about, but it also includes any federal grants that you receive and also any other grants and donations that you receive. And then you have your nutrition fund, which back and forth between the name, it can either be called a cafeteria fund or a food service fund, and then you also have your textbook fund. And so in addition to the previous regulations that I stated in terms of the roles of the council and the school board, I'm also going to talk about some of the codes as it pertains to the Virginia State Code, and most recently make sure to back it up in the council's ordinance. So the Code of Virginia 22.1100 states that any funds that are unspended by the schools revert back to its original area except for grants. What this means is that if there's any local money that is given to the schools, it reverts back to the locality. And to make sure that that was clear, because that was part of the confusion a little bit, between administrations. In our ordinance for FY '26, we made sure we added the language that said all spent funds under this ordinance or any other following ordinance to the schools will lapse at the end of the year as pertaining to that code by the state, and any encumbered funds that have not been spent also lapses and is supposed to come back, not unless you come back and ask for a reappropriation. And this is a code that was recently shared by the city treasurer with your former chairman. Is that 22.1-91 talks about the limitation on expenditures, where that no school board shall expend or contract to spend any funds in excess of what has been given to you. If you do, then it's considered to be malfeasance. And so, very high level of the role.
Would you say, excuse me, would you say that again? Would you go do that one last one again?
This code just states that if any funds are expended more than what the locality has given to the school board, then that is considered to be violating, and it can be considered to be malfeasance.
Malfeasance, thank you.
And so, let's talk about the role in the city treasurer in all of this. Now, my council will remember, and some of the public will as well, as during my presentation for the FY '26 budget, I showed this frame to just basically say that the city treasurer is responsible for every form of revenue that comes into the city. But directly how it pertains to the education funds, in 22.1-116, it states that the treasurer is charged with the responsibility of the receipt, custody, and disbursement of the funds of the school board, and shall keep funds in an account or account separate and distinct from all other funds. And of that same chapter 120, it states that the school board, that the treasurer has settled with the school board the school funds as of June 30th, but no later than August the 15th. And so let's talk about a prelude on how we got here. So in February of 2026, I attended a meeting inside of the superintendent's office, and I believe at that meeting was Dr. Holt, Dr. Carter, Dr. Walters, Tracy Morrison, the finance director, and there was one other person, but I can't say who the other person was, so I won't give a name and speculate who it was. But we went over this sheet right here, in which the schools had identified that the city owed to the schools $2.7 million. And I listened to what they shared with me, and then my dialogue back and forth at that time went a little something like this. Your required local match that you're claiming that is due to you, based off of the calculation at that time, is a fluid number. That the final number that comes out, the March ADM number, has not been finalized, so I don't know if this is a true number. So this is not something that I would take back to council to ask them to appropriate, because the March ADM numbers had not been finalized. I understand it may have been past practices of management to take whenever the number changed back to council, but that was not something that I was going to continue. I was going to wait until that final number came out. And then there was the discussion of the overspending of, not overspending, but the roof expenditures had an overage. And my question was, well, I need to see all documentation related to that, because according to their own spreadsheet that they shared with me, there was $2 million that was allocated for each of those projects, but not all of the $2 million was reflected spent. So I needed to see all expenses and everything related to this project, so I'll know if this is a true overage. And I also had questions about who had the authority to approve any type of change order as it relates to the projects. And then there was the amount of $330,000 that was appropriated for capital expenses. And I even shared with them in that meeting that council can only appropriate your money according to those categories. So I didn't understand why the 330 was separate from the full amount of the local share, but it was explained to me that this amount was separate because it was at a request of a council member who wanted the school boards to have to come and ask for reimbursement every time they expended their funds. And I said, well, I will have to find out a little bit more about that. And then we get down to where they stated there was some reimbursement. So with this one, I do remember council, the April before I arrived to the city, reappropriated some money to the schools in FY 2024 for expenses in FY 2024. And that was related to the HVAC and it was related to the scanners. And I asked, did you ask the council to bring that money forward? And I was told no, because they believe that encumbered money automatically rolled forward. And I said, that's not true, according to the state law. And also, too, the 152,000 for the scanners had already been expended in 24, so it would not come forward to 25 because those funds was already expensed. So then a couple of days later, the school's finance director met with the city's interim finance director to go over this sheet again to talk about what is due to the schools, and the number increased. It increased to $5.3 million. And so I had not spoken with my interim finance director at the time because I didn't even know what their conversation or the meeting was going to be about. But the conversation sort of similarly to the ones that I had in my prior meeting, hers went the same way. I'm going to start from the bottom and work my way up, that the 152 for the scanners had already been expensed in 24, so therefore it would be booked back to 24. That the 582 million for the HVAC should have been asked to roll forward and encumbered forward. Now again, these expenses for the HVAC did not happen until November of 24, even though council gave it to them in April of 24, but they should have asked for it to come forward into the new year. And then the ADM numbers, again, having to wait until the March number comes out before we do anything, and the state finalize what those numbers are. And then they talked about the capital expense. We could see that, she could see it in the budget and say, okay, that is something that is due to the schools. And then the final amount as of February 28, 2025, it was being said that 2.67 was due to the schools, when actually that number should have been reduced by $1 million. So let's talk about the 24-25 budget. So this is an excerpt taken out of the city's adopted fiscal year budget, where it states that the amount that was appropriated to the schools was $18.6 million. This includes money that was appropriated to the textbook and the cafeteria fund. But this sheet was shared with the city finance staff to show that it was approved by the school board in June of 2024, that the total budget was $19.8 million. They somehow took the number of the 18.6, that was 18.8 that was given to the 18.6 that was given to the schools. They had put up there that was 18.8, and then they added the textbook and the nutrition, which made the beginning balance that the schools was starting with to be off. And so now let's unpack the problem. So whenever we had to sit down and talk to the schools, and then later even with the treasurer, it was always two things we was having to address: appropriation versus what was spent. So appropriation just sets the limit in terms of what you cannot go past for your spending for that year. And what is spent, we was talking about actuals, what actually got paid and went out. And so we had to always break that down and say appropriation is one thing, but spending is another. And so on May 6th and May 15th, myself and my interim finance director and the superintendent and his finance director met to talk about the FY 25 and the amendments that they were waiting on to happen to be appropriated to the schools. It was during the April 15th meeting in our discussion where we was talking about having to verify some of the numbers, and we'll get into those numbers a little bit later. And the question was asked of the finance director, what would happen if the city did not give you those funds? And she indicated that that means that the schools would have overspent their money. And so that triggered a conversation for me to go have with the treasurer, because I wanted to know, because I had a staff member to say to me that we share a bank account with the schools. And so I went to the treasurer and I asked her, I said, okay, I was just in a meeting with the schools. And in there, the finance director indicated that if we don't give them money back, they would have overspent their budget. And I'm asking you this question because it is my understanding that we share a bank account. And the treasurer went on to explain what that type of account was, separate but together, yes, and separate in this meaning that the schools have what you call a zero-based banking account. And so what that means is that the schools write checks on that account, and whenever those checks come in and hit that account, it draws off our joint bank account to make it zero, to make it whole. And so that led into some more discussion about tracking and ability and all of those things. And so, again, the confusion of who has the ability to increase the budget appropriation for schools, which is your spending limit, is it the city council or is it the school board? It is the city council, as I shared with you all before. It's not the school board. So even if something comes before the school board to say, hey, we have some additional money, and you all vote to increase it based off of what it is, what you're really doing is just giving approval for that to come before the council to get approved to increase your appropriation spending limit for that year. And then it comes down to communication regarding those adjustments. Sometimes, always, I'm gonna say this part first, always the communication is directed to the city manager, but it can go to a finance person. Sometimes even I received information when we had an interim city manager who was still working with the city, information went to her as well. But really it should just go to the finance department because those two departments should be talking because that's where the validation is gonna happen. The only thing I'm gonna do once the finance director tells me it's okay to move forward is get it on the agenda. And again, we're looking at budgeted revenues and expenditures compared to what was actual revenues and expenditures, and whose role is it to maintain and monitor those things? Is it the city administration, schools, or is it the treasurer? And so when I look at the current process and procedures, one of the things we talked about when all three of us was meeting as a group, and that's the treasurers, the school administration, and the city administration, we talked about how the checks are being processed, how the checks goes from the school's finance department to the treasurer, and then an email is sent to the city administration for us to lump sum post that to an expenditure line on our side. And there is no reconciliation of cash done by the schools. And the city does a pool cash balance based on a summary, not by fund and finance. So when you are looking at what is actually due to the city or due from the city, this will be reflected in your annual report that happens every year, your ACFR. And there was no due tos or due from the city reflected. So even in those two prior spreadsheets that I shared with you, from my meeting with the schools and from the interim finance director meeting with the schools, those amounts were not reflected in the ACFR as a due from the city. And also too, and we're gonna get into this a little bit later, there was a very large amount of grant money that was being asked to roll forward. That was not even reflected in your ACFR. And also there is a difference between the two systems that we have. The schools have RDA, which is a cash-based system, and the city have admins, which is an accrual-based system, which is generally the standard type of system that you would use in government to track your expenses. Your cash-based one is basically almost like one you would use to run a small business or household. And so when it comes to the roles and responsibility, when it comes to monitoring everything, who is responsible for doing that? And so one of the things we walked away with knowing is that this is for all parties. We are absent of any type of cohesive process or procedure, that there's deficiency in training when it comes to some of this, because not everybody has municipal financing background. And when you're coming from an outside into local government, you really do need to understand that. On the school side, you need to understand how the schools interact with the local government, and local government personnel needs to understand how school operates within its budget. And then so there's deficiency in training on both of those parts. And again, checking for accuracy when we receive the information to make sure, one, when the city receives the information, is this something that is correct that we're getting that we can post to our accounts? One, schools making sure that what they send over did actually take place, so they can have the appropriate spending authority to do so. And then also, two, with the treasurer, us having to rely back and forth and communicating that information. And so again, one of the things to narrow down just for the city, we have limited skilled personnel. In fact, right now we have limited personnel right now in our finance department, so that is contributing a little bit to some of what is going on when it comes to having to post the revenues and expenditures timely. And when it comes to the city treasurer, even her own knowledge, she's been relying heavily on the two finance departments to tell her what is appropriate and what should be happening, and recognizing that there has not been any cash reconciliation between the two areas, between the city and the schools, to make sure that we're within our limits. And also, two, one of the things that the treasurer never received before is an actual copy of the appropriation authority from either the schools for representing what the city can spend within their limit, or what the schools can spend within their limit. And so some of the things that led to how we got here is miscalculations on the school side. Again, beginning cash balances, and I get into that a little bit later, misunderstanding what that really is, what the approved fiscal year was for the school versus what the school board was working with, and then the available amount of money to carry forward. I talked to you about the grants. I talked to you about the misunderstanding of money that was given on capital projects to come forward. And then there is no tracking of outstanding checks. Your system right now, I think, and Ms. Morrison can correct me, it does not allow you to be able to track when the check has cleared or has not cleared, that there's no way to track that liability at all. And one of the things that that we showed on our side from 24 is that the schools had over $1 million of outstanding checks, but in your completed APFR that was done by your auditor, it doesn't reflect it at all. And then also too, the way your payroll goes, you have your payrolls that can cross fiscal years based on whether you're a 10 or 12-month employee, and so therefore you need to be able to have your due to your employees show up in your account as a liability, and that's not even reflected in your APFR. And so this is what I'm talking about when I say that there's some confusion about what your beginning balances was. So this number right here, and I know it's small and I apologize, but this line talks about your cash and cash equivalent. This is an anticipation. This may not be all cash. So, but this is just telling you that this is what the anticipated numbers, or what you think your